Hi, I'm Carl.
And I'm Andrew, and this is a program called Setting the Record Straight.
Hi, I'm Carl.
I'm Andrew.
And today on Setting the Record Straight, we're going to discuss another common objection that people have to Christianity.
If there's a God, how can he allow so much suffering and evil?
In the last two shows, we dealt with several common objections to Christianity. In show number 1, why are Christians such hypocrites? And in show number 2, isn't the Bible a myth, and hasn't science disproven Christianity?
You know, there's so many questions that we could have touched on in the last couple of weeks. If we had more time, it'd be nice to be able to do more of this in the future and maybe even have a forum where some people would come on board and ask us some questions.
Yeah, that would be good. But before we get into today's discussion, I think it's always good that we remind ourselves why we're doing this show and the audience why we're doing this show. You know, there's so much misinformation and misunderstanding about Orthodox Christianity, what the Bible actually says, and this misinformation is sort of becoming a Western cultural phenomenon where it's acceptable for moral relativity to be to make self-defeating statements even seem logical.
Yeah, you hear so many people say things like, well, that may be true for you, but it's not really true for me, and it's just so this kind of moral relativity comes into the framework, doesn't it?
Yeah, or you hear things like there's no such thing as absolute truth, or plain old there's no such thing as truth.
And that's the rub. If there's any moral objectivity or not, or said another way, are there truths that apply to everybody, to all human beings, or just to some?
Or people come up with the question or the statement, there's no such thing as truth. And for personal preferences like ice cream or art, it works fine. But where moral objectivity is concerned, you know, a logical conundrum results.
Conundrum, that's rather a large word for you, isn't it? So the question is there moral objectivity or not? Said another way, are there some truths that apply to all human beings?
And that, I think, segues into today's topic, and we'll touch on it a little bit more, but I think it's, on the whole, it should be another show or two, you know, so we can go into lengthy discussion on that later. But
so how can a loving, omnipotent God that the Bible showcases allow so much evil and human suffering to exist? Why doesn't he stop it? He either doesn't have the power to do so, or he doesn't want to, he's not powerful enough. Therefore, an all-loving and powerful, omnipotent God can't really exist. That's sort of the question that many people raise, do they not?
Well, that's the popular argument today. I mean, I've had lots of people come up to me in the past and say, you know, if God really does exist, how can he allow so much pain and suffering and evil in the world? He must be a masochist. And that works just fine if you work from the premise that a world where evil and pain and suffering isn't allowed to exist, it's prevented from existing, would be better than the world we actually have now. And I think it's important in this show to test out that premise and that logic and see if it holds water.
So it has to do with choices, and you were going to say something, I think, about choices.
Well, give me a chance and I'll say
All
them.
right.
So let me ask you a direct question. What kind of father would you be if you could control your children all their lives, if you could control their thoughts whenever they were going to have an evil thought, you could change it into playing in meadows with daisies and playing with puppy dogs, you know, just nice thoughts about people. So whenever they were going to have an evil thought, it couldn't happen.
It'd be great if I'm a teenager, wouldn't it?
Most parents would probably agree with that.
But seriously, I'd be taking away their freedom of choice, would I not? To make mistakes, good or bad, and even perhaps to do evil. I'd be taking away their freedom of choice.
Well, yeah, and to go a step further, you'd be limiting their free choice, their free will, and really by definition, life connotes free will. I mean, it sort of means the same thing. And how can you have life without free will?
So it'd be
in my
twisted.
opinion.
You know, as a parent, you'd have to give even your small child some degree of autonomy, wouldn't you, at whatever age, to screw up. Otherwise, they'll never mature, they'll never grow enough, and they'll never know the difference between a good and bad, or loving somebody unconditionally. If you allowed that, you'd never give them a chance to grow up.
Right, and really the God of the Bible is defined as all-loving. I mean, this is right out of the Bible. It's defined as all-loving, omnipotent, and in order to make his most prized creation, which is us, I mean, he created angels and he created other celestial beings, but in order to make us in his image, he had to, you know, we have to have some immaterial traits that are like God, and they include creativity. The Bible says, you know, we're creative like God. We have intelligence. We have a spiritualness about us. We're logical. We're moral. We're deliberate. We have a will, and we have choice to obey God or not, to commit evil or to commit good acts. And the Bible teaches that Lucifer, mainly the Old Testament, that Lucifer began this cycle of evil and suffering. And again, this isn't our opinion. This comes straight out of the Bible.
But why couldn't God just prevent evil from coming into the world? It sounds a bit like he created it.
Right. You know, I think before we go there, we have to really define what evil is. You know, we're playing around with the word and not really defining it.
Okay, but biblically, evil is not a thing. It really is the absence of good, which is inherent in any part of God's creation, is it not?
Right. And
it's the absence of something, the absence of good.
It is, and it does seem perfectly reasonable that if a loving God exists, like it says in the Bible, that he could stop evil and suffering.
I think that's true, but you know, to stop evil choices, he would have to control us, take away our choice. Isn't that true? Or could he do that?
Right. The question is, did God have a choice to give us choice or not? And so, you know, when I look at the audience, I say, do you think God, if you're a deist, if you believe God exists, do you think and specifically the God of the Bible, do you believe God had a choice to give us choice? I think biblically the Bible says clearly God didn't really have a choice. But, you know, we'll get into that. I mean, if God could intervene and prevent pain and suffering and evil from existing, but specifically evil from existing, then we're saying that he could stop and change our thoughts. If we were about to think of an evil act, he could stop it and change it. He could stop an attacker's hand, and he could theoretically do that, but if he did, he would be controlling us and really in a way that would be by definition unloving. And so that would...
You said a couple of times before that when you were young, that's one of the reasons why you sort of rejected God for a while, because you didn't want him to control you in some way.
I wasn't really a deist anyway. I mean, I sort of was, but yeah, there's no way that I would allow God to control me.
Well, what about God being omnipotent? Shouldn't he be able to do everything, anything, anytime?
It seems logical that God would be able to do anything he wants if he's omnipotent, but by definition, omnipotence in the Bible, God being omnipotent, doesn't mean what most people think it means. My son one time came to me when he was younger, and he would remember this, and he came to me with a smirk on his face, and he said, you know, if God is all-powerful, can he create a rock that he can't lift?
Yeah, that famous statement. Yeah.
Right, and to his surprise, I said, no, God can't do that. And he said, wait a minute, I thought you told me God could do anything. And I said, well, not quite. I said God could do anything that's logical, reasonable, and not against his nature.
Can't sin, for example.
He can't sin, and that's clear in the Bible. But there's some other things that God can't do. The biblical God, you know, Elohim, he can't sin clearly. He can't lie. He can't murder, anything like that. But what he can, there's other things he can't do. God can't divide by zero. Okay, he is the mathematician of mathematicians. He created the mathematical laws of logic, laws of nature. He can't divide by zero. He can't create a four-sided triangle. He can't create a circle without a
And
center.
he can't break his own rules, his own laws.
He can't break his own laws, because if he does, he's a lawbreaker, and that's sin, and God is sinless. And so if you say he sinned, then that's breaking the law of non-contradiction.
All right, so those same laws would exist anyway, even if humans did not, wouldn't they?
Absolutely, but those laws of logic and God not breaking them, and he can't break them because by definition of who he is, that just confirms that logic and reason are immutable, irrefutable laws of the universe that we have to follow, and they transcend humanity. I mean, God created them, and as I said,
humans didn't
he can't
invent
break
them
them.
in
Right.
any way. Okay.
That's right, and that
So
I think is easily provable, that humans didn't create these
All right.
laws.
So we're saying that this world is full of evil. That seems to beget suffering, and it's the only world that we could have. In effect, I mean, it's a bit problematic. The message that's woven through this.
Right, and if God could control us, if he chose to, he wouldn't be who he is. He would be a man-made Hellenistic deity.
So he couldn't do it, is what you're saying. He couldn't do it.
Stop playing with me.
All right. Well, I've got free will, don't I? So I can say whatever I want.
Right. Hey, look, the Bible says that God is love, and so to not allow people to do, or angels or other celestial creatures that he created to do things contrary to his will would not be loving. He simply can't.
Impossible.
He can't do it. There's such a thing as divine providence. There's miracles. People say, "Oh, well, God has miracles, so and isn't that changing things? Isn't that intervening?" Yes, but we can suspend natural laws as well.
All right.
We can suspend gravity. We have control over that. And if we have control over natural laws, I think God can have control over natural laws, and he can certainly suspend them when he wants to.
All right, so you're saying he can't do it, it's not loving, but couldn't that be construed as trivializing suffering? A lot of people, most suffering people bring upon themselves. You could argue they get what they deserve. The man takes the drugs, the man overeats, he gets obese, he gets other problems, he drinks too much alcohol, he gets addicted, they steal, they murder. Most suffering is done by other men. And that's understandable. So God doesn't cause most of the suffering, man does most of the suffering, and the Bible says that man is sinful, he's totally depraved, that he causes it all. But what about the question about a single mother or child starving to death, a 2-year-old in Namibia somewhere, and where man didn't cause some of that? You could say, why does God allow something like that to happen? How do you deal with that? You want me to explain it.
You first.
Well, I'd say in just about every case, except the 2-year-old Namibian example, and as I said before, that the suffering of others is mostly created by man. Dictators and corruption and mismanagement, and even the 2-year-old that's suffering in Namibia. There's plenty of food in the world. There's plenty of agricultural surpluses. People starving in Africa and other places. These kind of stereotypes is usually from mismanagement, a man doing things incorrectly. It isn't God that's causing that. Even diseases, for example, we can ship pharmaceuticals and medicines to everybody. We do. Much of it is improved. But a lot of man's suffering is done by other men, is it not?
Right. And as soon as two people have free will, their free wills are going to collide, and they're going to cause pain and suffering in the other. And as soon as you have 6 billion people, then you have 6 billion people with free will, and their free wills are going to collide, and it's going to inherently cause pain and suffering. You could have a child or a relative or whatever, and they may become addicted to heroin or some opiate. Well, they're not just causing pain and suffering in themselves. They're causing a plethora of pain and suffering in a lot of people.
That's right.
But the problem with the 2-year-old, in Namibia, who hasn't caused any problems with anyone, I think your answer is a couple of beers short of a six-pack.
Well, it's a tough question, isn't it? I mean, I don't quite know the answer to some of that.
So basically, your logic is that God has to allow free will, in angels and all his creation, or he wouldn't be who he is. So he can't stop
Evil
all
decisions.
these evil decisions and suffering. He might be able to, and I'll use a word that's probably too big for you. He can't ameliorate it, but he can certainly, he can ameliorate it, but he can't stop evil decisions and pain and suffering.
So suffering is an inevitable consequence. The Bible speaks about the fact that man is going to suffer because of his inherent sinful nature.
Right. So let's go back to that 2-year-old.
So it's biblical.
Because I think the audience and most people and Christians understand clearly, like, okay, it's reasonable now. I see this, that suffering and pain is inevitable if we're going to have free will. You can't have free will and have no pain and suffering.
Okay.
Okay, because we basically, you can have free will and have a world with no pain and suffering if no one decides to commit that act of evil,
But that's
that first
impossible
act.
because man is sinful by nature.
Right, but when,
Okay.
we can get into the theology of that, but basically, if you have pain and suffering and evil, there has to be good, because you can't have it without
Okay.
pure goodness, and God's the only one that is good.
Okay.
So again, what about the 2-year-old? Tough luck for the 2-year-old?
Well, it's a hard question for us to deal with, but okay, you started this in some ways, so why don't you finish
No,
it?
I think you did. You talked about the 2-year-old.
Okay.
So you want me to have a crack at it?
The Bible and God looks at death in a certain way. You want to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, look, the thing that's hard about pain and suffering, again, is the 2-year-old who hasn't done anything to anybody. They haven't caused suffering in anyone else. And there is an idea, it's not an idea, often we think of little children even raised in a family that there's been no abuse or anything like that. Children don't suffer. I think, as other apologists have talked about, like Tim Keller, to say that a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 1-year-old doesn't suffer, relatively speaking, any less than we do as adults, I think is ridiculous. When a kid is crying for something that they want, they're in this emotional pain. And I think, and partly it's, and and you could say, oh, well, isn't that, that's sinful? Well, little kids don't know any better. God doesn't hold them accountable, just like he wouldn't hold a 2-year-old accountable for what they do. But I think God looks at life and death in a totally different way than we do, is what the Bible talks about.
Well, the oldest person in the world is only about 113 years old, so it's a very temporal kind of a concept in terms of God. I mean, isn't that what you were...
Right. God looks at time in a non-temporal reality. The way he looks at life and death is in a non-temporal reality.
Like a drop of water in a huge ocean or something.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
There is a guy, I think, that's 113 years old. There's someone else in another country that claims he's 145 years old. I don't know about that as well, but I know the one that's documented. There's a guy that's 113 years old. He was a victim of the Holocaust, at least a sufferer, but he didn't die, obviously. He's 113. He lives in Israel, but even his life, as you say, isn't even a drop of water in an ocean of time.
All right.
And what God says to us in the Bible is basically our life here mathematically doesn't even exist. It does, but mathematically, all of our life exists somewhere else. Because this time is so short. And the Bible teaches that pain and suffering has a purpose. It has an important purpose. And we think about the raising of our children, or we think about pain and suffering that's been caused in our lives, either from us doing it or someone else. I can't think of any pain and suffering where I haven't taken away something valuable from it.
All right.
And little kids, if they're going to have a tantrum when we don't allow them to do something, if we say, oh, okay, well, we're not going to keep it from you, we're going to let you have whatever you want, and that'll take away your pain and suffering. Well, we all know that's not true. In fact, that may make their pain and suffering down the road far, far worse. So pain and suffering, I think, is essential, and God tells us it's essential. So, the question we come to is really the most difficult one. What about the child that has leukemia and is sitting in a bed at Children's Hospital? They haven't done anything to anybody. The 2-year-old in Namibia who's starving to death.
So it's really the Christian's job to help minimize that child's suffering, is it not? God put us here to do it.
Right.
He can't take
Right.
away our freedom, not love us. We see this life as everything, but it isn't.
No, it isn't. It isn't. And the thing is about that 2-year-old, going back to that, they didn't do anything necessarily to deserve that, okay? And God doesn't, if you're like this, God comes and punishes you for that. No, I don't think the Bible teaches that He intervenes in that way. But as far as that 2-year-old goes, or another child suffering, they aren't going to necessarily learn anything from that lesson. They may. But the question is, does everyone else learn anything from that lesson?
Why don't you jump back to the topic of evil for a
Well,
minute?
let's just finish this. Let's finish this idea, because I think it's important to bring it to its conclusion. So, do we learn anything from the suffering of that 2-year-old, or from the suffering of someone? And I think we do. I think what we learn is that we need to do something so that 2-year-old isn't starving to death.
Okay.
Now, about the kid in bed who's suffering with leukemia, or whatever else, what God says is, because this life is so short, and because this life really, this is not all that matters. What the Bible talks about, and what Paul and the apostles and disciples write about, is really that the momentary troubles and sufferings, whether intense like Christ or that 2-year-old or another child, while they're intense, compared to the life to come and compared to what God's going to give us, is almost nothing in comparison.
Okay.
And of that little child, when that little child dies, they're going to experience the best that God has to offer.
All right.
And again, that doesn't minimize our pain when we see it happen, but it's our job as Christians and non-Christians, but as God's creation, to minimize suffering and do everything we can to, really to stop it.
So back to the subject of evil. If you're an atheist, you really have no reasonable argument to believe that evil exists.
Yeah, let's think about it.
For that matter, because
if you're an atheist, then we came into being by accident.
Okay.
And I could get into the science of life and how life came to be, but ultimately scientists all agree now that the Big Bang is all this was created from nothing.
All right.
Is there any explanation scientifically for that? No, it's not out there.
Okay.
No one has an explanation for it. How did the first cell come into being? That's even a bigger conundrum. So
it's a cosmic accident.
Right. So if it's
luck,
a cosmic accident,
Yeah.
and no one's held responsible for anything,
well, there's no objective right and wrong.
why? There is no evil.
Okay.
So I can steal your car, and in your opinion, it's wrong, and in the
Okay.
government's opinion, it might be wrong. But really, it's just your opinion over mine.
So ultimately, for the atheist, the Holocaust even is a morally relative issue. It was only wrong from a certain point of view, because we're just a confluence of stardust and cosmic explosion and so forth, and accident, and there's no real meaning in life, and natural selection and evolution are a reason for existence.
Right. Natural selection and evolution should be our modus operandi for doing what we do. And sure, we can do nice things, and hopefully and we can be an important figure in history. But ultimately, we're worm food, and it's over. And really, what the Bible teaches is that
So life has no meaning if there's no God.
It has no meaning. You get up in the morning. Why even procreate and have kids? Because you go through the doldrums of life. And really, it's meaningless without God. And for the atheist to disapprove or disagree with that stance, they really have to
bring God into the equation.
They have to bring God into the equation. They have to bring logic into the equation, which really, the stance they have to take is essentially illogical.
Okay. So life's no meaning without God, and you were going to say a little bit more about what what we're going to, if we're really honest with ourselves, we seldom have anything but selfish, prideful thoughts, altruistic. No way, there are no clear moral laws, none
Right.
of that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have to believe, if we are honest, that there are objective truths, that there's objective morality. You and I believe that. Everyone on the planet knows it's wrong, for example, to torture babies. I don't care what.
Everyone agrees, and there's a whole. And to use just one example,
And
Right.
every society, no society that I know values cowardice, for example.
right?
I mean, there's no society.
Those
I mean,
are self-evident truths,
Okay,
and there's a bunch
so-
of morals that are self-evident. The question is, where do they come from?
who
If-
gives us this common notion?
Look, if there are moral rules, okay, objective rules, there's got to be a rule maker.
Okay.
Okay, that's just a fact. There has to be a rule maker, and they're self-evident. And the writers of the Constitution took right from Romans chapter 2 that it's self-evident. And so there it is in the Constitution. We
Christianity
find
and
these things self-evident.
The Christianity in the Bible, the Scripture tells us that moral objectivity does exist, and there's meaning of life. And for atheists, Buddhists, Muslim, Jews, we know that there are self-evident truths. And as you mentioned before, Romans 2 talks about it. And as you mentioned, the Constitution. Okay, that's enough. Enough for today, isn't it? I mean, we've had
Yeah.
a bit. What are we going to do next time?
Today was a hard hat day. Is there ever not a hard hat day? Next month, we're going to discuss another common objection to Christianity. If there is
there only one way?
Is there only one way to God? Right.
Okay,
And so,
so
go ahead.
we want to set the record straight. Go to vineyardapologist.com and you'll find our video link and past shows and related links.
Or you can email us.
Okay, play nice.
Play nice.
Okay. How many minutes was that?
I don't know.